Adiz, the girl, described a hidden room, and it was real. Chapter 1. The Victorian farmhouse stood against the Connecticut countryside like a weathered guardian, its wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of decades. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against the car window, watching their new home emerge through the morning mist, while Ben navigated the gravel driveway. In the back seat, 7-year-old Ilara sat perfectly still, her dark eyes tracking every detail of the property with an intensity that made Sarah's chest tighten. 3 months since the adoption was finalized, and the little girl still moved through life like she was cataloging exits. "Look at all that space to run around," Ben said, forcing cheer into his voice as he parked. "We could get a swing set, maybe even build a treehouse in that oak." Ilara's only response was to unbuckle her seatbelt with practiced efficiency, waiting for permission to exit. Sarah had learned not to rush these moments. The social worker had warned them that children from the foster system often operated on invisible protocols, rules written by survival rather than childhood. The house smelled of lemon oil and fresh paint, evidence of the seller's last-minute attempts to mask its age. Sarah had fallen in love with it immediately during their virtual tour, imagining Ilara baking cookies in the spacious kitchen, reading in the window seats, healing in rooms filled with afternoon light. But as they toured the space together, Ilara showed no interest in the renovated bathrooms or the attic playroom Ben had already started planning to convert. Instead, she stopped in the second-floor hallway, her small hand reaching toward a section of faded floral wallpaper. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah knelt beside her, careful to maintain the distance Ilara required. The wallpaper here was different from the rest, older, with tiny roses that had once been red but had faded to the color of dried blood. Ilara's fingers hovered an inch from the surface, tracing patterns only she could see. "Someone was sad here," Ilara whispered. It wasn't a question. That first week they attributed her behavior to adjustment. Ilara would eat her meals quickly, hiding crackers in her pockets, despite Sarah's gentle assurances that food would always be available. She slept fully clothed, her backpack beside her bed packed with essentials. But it was the wall that drew her back, again and again. She would sit cross-legged before it, whispering conversations that drifted down the stairs like moth wings. "She's processing," Ben said one evening, finding Sarah standing in the doorway of their bedroom, listening to the faint murmur of Ilara's voice. "The therapist said imaginative play is healthy. She's probably never had the chance to just be a kid before." Sarah wanted to agree, but something in Ilara's tone, the careful rhythm of conversation with pauses for responses no one else could hear, made her uneasy. She'd worked with traumatized children at the community center before Ilara came into their lives. She knew the difference between imagination and something deeper, though she couldn't name what she was witnessing. The first detailed description came during dinner the following Tuesday. Ilara pushed peas around her plate, constructing careful borders between foods that couldn't touch. When she announced, "The boy says thank you for being quiet. His head hurts when people yell." Ben exchanged a glance with Sarah. "What boy, honey?" "The boy in the star room, behind the roses." Ilara's eyes remained fixed on her plate. "He's been waiting a very long time. The wallpaper in his room has stars that glow, but they're tired now. He has a rocking horse with one eye missing and a music box that plays a song about rain. He showed me through the crack." "What crack?" Sarah kept her voice level, therapeutic. Ilara finally looked up, her expression patient, as if explaining something obvious to well-meaning but slow adults. "The crack where the wall isn't a wall anymore, where someone made it wrong because they were in a hurry." She returned to her peas. "He says his name is Timothy, but everyone called him Timmy, except when he was in trouble. Then he was Timothy James." That night, after Ilara was asleep, Sarah found herself examining the wallpapered section with a flashlight while Ben searched property records on his laptop. The house was built in 1892, renovated multiple times, most recently in 1987. Nothing about hidden rooms or children named Timothy. But as Sarah ran her fingers along the wall's surface, she felt it, a slight give in one section, a hollow sound when she tapped. She told herself it was probably just settling. Old houses were full of quirks, but she couldn't shake the image of Ilara's earnest face, the specific details that felt too elaborate for a 7-year-old's invention. Chapter 2. Dr. Patricia Holbrook's office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored brownstone in Hartford, 40 minutes from their rural home. She specialized in adoption trauma and came highly recommended by the agency. Ilara sat in the leather chair, her feet dangling inches from the floor, drawing the same picture she'd drawn for 3 sessions now, a wall covered in roses with a door hidden behind them. "Tell me about Timothy," Dr. Holbrook said, her tone professionally neutral. Sarah and Ben watched from behind the two-way mirror, a privilege granted only after extensive discussion about therapeutic boundaries. Ilara's crayon paused. "He's not Timothy to me. He's the boy who knows about waiting." She selected a blue crayon, adding stars to the edges of her paper. "Like how I knew about waiting. In the different houses, different beds. He waited in his room for someone to remember he was there. How long did he wait? Until the wallpaper covered him up, until the roses grew over his door." Ilara switched to brown, drawing what looked like a horse. "He says people forgot on purpose because remembering hurt too much. His mom went to the hospital and didn't come back. His dad put him in the room with his toys and a sandwich and said to be quiet, be good, someone would come. But the dad got confused. Sick confused, Timothy says. The kind where your brain becomes a stranger." Sarah's hand found Ben's behind the mirror. They'd read about children creating elaborate fantasies to process their own trauma, projecting their experiences onto imaginary friends. But the detail, the consistency, it was unsettling. "Ilara," Dr. Holbrook leaned forward slightly, "do you understand that Timothy isn't real? That sometimes our minds create friends to help us feel less alone?" Ilara looked up then, her dark eyes holding a wisdom that seemed ancient in her young face. "Just because grown-ups can't see something doesn't mean it isn't real. You can't see my hungry, but it's real. You can't see my scared, but it's real." She returned to her drawing. "Timothy is real the way forgotten things are real. Just because people stopped looking doesn't mean he stopped existing." On the drive home, Ben tried to fill the silence with observations about the changing leaves, the farm stands they passed, anything but the weight of Ilara's words. Sarah stared out the window, remembering her grandmother's house, how they'd found a root cellar during renovations that no one knew existed. Time had a way of erasing things, especially things people wanted to forget. That evening, Ilara set a plate of crackers by the wall before bed. "He doesn't need them," she explained when Sarah asked, "but he likes knowing someone remembered." Sarah found herself Googling the house's history again after Ilara was asleep, diving deeper into archived newspapers and historical records. The Hartford Courant from 1952 mentioned the house briefly in a property transfer notice after the death of James Whitman. No mention of family. Ben found her at 3 in the morning, surrounded by printouts. "You're feeding into this," he said gently, sitting beside her at the kitchen table. "We're supposed to be helping her distinguish reality from fantasy, not investigating her ghost stories." "It's not a ghost story." Sarah showed him a census record from 1950. James Whitman lived here with his wife Margaret and son Timothy, aged 6. Margaret died in 1951, complications from pneumonia. James sold the house in early 1952 and disappeared from records. No death certificate for Timothy, no school enrollment records after 1951. Ben studied the papers, his engineering mind working through probabilities. They probably moved, started over somewhere. Lots of people did that after losing a spouse back then. But Sarah couldn't let it go. The next day, while Ilara was at school and Ben at work, she returned to the hallway with a bucket of warm water and a sponge. She told herself she was just cleaning, but she worked carefully on the old wallpaper, loosening its edges, where age had already begun the process. In one corner, she found what Ilara had described as a crack. It wasn't a crack at all, but a seam, painted over multiple times, where something had been added to the original wall structure. Her phone rang, the school's number flashing. Ilara had had an episode, they said. Not violent, just distressed. She'd been learning about family trees in social studies and had insisted on adding Timothy to hers, growing agitated when told she could only include real family members. Sarah abandoned her investigation, guilt and worry propelling her toward the car. Whatever truth lived in that wall would have to wait. Her daughter, her very real, very troubled daughter, needed her now. Chapter 3. The November rain hammered against the windows as Sarah found Ilara in her usual spot by the wall, but this time she wasn't alone. Ben sat beside her, his large frame folded awkwardly on the floor, listening as Ilara explained Timothy's daily routine. Sarah paused in the doorway, watching her husband, who'd been growing increasingly frustrated with their daughter's fixation, now giving her his complete attention. "He watches the sunrise through the stars," Ilara was saying, pointing to a specific spot on the wallpaper. "The glowing ones, they catch light first. Then he plays with his horse, but quietly, because making noise meant his dad would remember he was there, and remembering made his dad cry." "That must have been hard for Timothy," Ben said softly. Ilara nodded solemnly. The hardest part was not knowing if quiet meant safe or forgotten. That evening, after Ilara was in bed, Ben found Sarah in the garage, sorting through tools. "We're going to look," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah met his eyes, relief flooding through her. She'd been carrying the weight of believing alone. They waited until the weekend, sending Ilara for a playdate with her only school friend, Emma, whose mother had been wonderfully patient with Ilara's peculiarities. Armed with a stud finder, crowbars, and a reciprocating saw, they returned to the hallway. Ben ran the stud finder along the wall, mapping the hidden architecture. The readings were inconsistent in the exact spot Ilara favored, suggesting a modified structure. "There's definitely something here," Ben muttered, marking measurements on the wall. "The framing doesn't match the rest of the hallway." They worked carefully, cutting through layers of wallpaper and paint, decades of covering and recovering. Sarah peeled back the floral pattern, revealing older paper underneath featuring faded circus animals, then another layer with Art Deco geometrics, each renovation an attempt to forget what lay beneath. Finally, they reached wood paneling, and there it was, the outline of a door, painted over so many times it had become part of the wall. Ben used the crowbar to work at the edges, while Sarah held a flashlight. The door resisted, sealed by years of paint and humidity, but finally gave way with a sound like a held breath releasing. The smell hit them first, stale air tinged with something sweet and sad, like flowers pressed too long in a book. The beam of Sarah's flashlight swept across a small room, maybe 6 by 8 feet. The walls were covered in wallpaper featuring stars that still held traces of phosphorescent paint. A wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, one glass eye missing, the other clouded with age. Dust particles danced in the light like suspended time. Ben stepped in first, testing the floor's stability. On a small shelf sat a music box, its enamel surface showing a scene of children playing in the rain. He wound the key carefully, and a tinny melody filled the space, hauntingly beautiful and deeply sad. Sarah recognized it as Singin' in the Rain, slowed to a lullaby's pace. But it was what they found next that broke Sarah's heart. In the corner, wrapped in a child-sized quilt, were the remains of a sandwich, preserved by the dry air, and a note written in a child's careful printing. "I am being good and quiet. Please come back." They stood in silence, two adults confronting a tragedy that had been painted over but never resolved. Ben pulled out his phone, his voice steady, as he called the police non-emergency line. There would be investigations, procedures, proper authorities to notify, but first they had to tell Ilara. She took it better than they expected. When they brought her home and showed her the opened room, she simply nodded, as if a truth she'd always known had finally been acknowledged. She walked to the rocking horse, running her small hand along its mane. "He's not here anymore," she said quietly. "He left when you opened the door. He was only waiting for someone to remember properly, to say his name and mean it." The investigation that followed revealed what they'd begun to piece together. James Whitman, overwhelmed by grief and showing signs of what would now be recognized as severe depression and cognitive decline, had likely told his son to wait in the room during one of his confused episodes. Neighbors reported James was found days later, deceased from a stroke. The house was quickly sold by distant relatives who never knew about the hidden room or the child inside. Whether Timothy had tried to leave and couldn't, or simply waited as instructed until it was too late, would never be fully known. Chapter 4. The memorial service was small, held on a crisp December morning in the town's oldest cemetery. They'd had to fight for it, Ben and Sarah, arguing with bureaucrats about the necessity of remembering a child whose death had never been properly recorded. But Dr. Holbrook had written letters, and Emma's mother had started a petition, and somehow the town had found funds for a small marble stone that read, Timothy James Whitman, 1945 to 1952, no longer forgotten. Ilara placed the rocking horse beside the stone, having insisted it didn't belong to anyone else. She stood between her parents, wearing the new blue coat Sarah had bought her, looking like any other 7-year-old except for the knowing in her eyes. "Thank you for believing me," she said quietly, taking Sarah's hand for the first time without being prompted. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in their house, in their family. The room was professionally cleaned and transformed into a reading nook, with a window seat Ben installed where light could finally enter. Ilara chose the paint color, a soft green she said felt like new grass. They kept one piece of the star wallpaper, framed now, hanging in the hallway, as a reminder that forgotten things deserved to be remembered. Ilara began to change too, gradually, like spring arriving one blade of grass at a time. She stopped hoarding food, trusting in tomorrow's meals. She started sleeping in pajamas instead of street clothes. She joined the art club at school and made another friend, Marcus, who didn't mind that she sometimes knew things she couldn't explain. On Christmas morning, she surprised them both by crawling into their bed before dawn, something she'd never done before. "Can we make pancakes?" she asked, her voice containing a lightness they'd never heard, the kind with faces. As Sarah mixed batter and Ben set the table, Ilara drew at the kitchen counter, but instead of walls and hidden doors, she drew their family, 3 figures holding hands in front of a house with all its windows open. When she finished, she handed it to Sarah. "For the refrigerator," she said solemnly, "so everyone knows we live here." Dr. Holbrook called it a breakthrough, the resolution of Ilara's transference, the successful integration of her trauma narrative. But Sarah thought it was simpler than that. Sometimes children knew truths that adults had forgotten how to see. Sometimes the only difference between imagination and intuition was whether anyone bothered to look behind the wallpaper. They never found official records of Timothy's death, and the case was eventually closed as a historical tragedy. But the town remembered now. The local historical society added his story to their records, a cautionary tale about grief and isolation, about the dangers of forgetting the vulnerable. Emma's mother, who turned out to be a journalist, wrote an article that prompted the state to review how they tracked missing children in the foster system. On the anniversary of finding the room, Ilara asked to visit the cemetery. She brought a new music box, one that played cheerful songs, and placed it on Timothy's stone. "So he knows what happy sounds like," she explained. Then she turned to her parents, her dark eyes clear and present. "Can we go home now? Ben promised to teach me chess, and you said we'd make soup." As they walked back to the car, Ilara between them, Sarah realized this was what family meant, not just the people you chose to love, but the ghosts you chose to honor, the stories you refused to let disappear. Their daughter had taught them that. 7 years old and already wise enough to know that some things needed witnessing before they could be released. The house felt different now, lighter, as if opening that door had let out more than stale air. Ilara still had difficult days, moments when the past pressed against the present like a bruise. But she faced them differently, knowing she had parents who would believe her, who would look behind walls if necessary, who would never paint over her truth. That night, as Sarah tucked her in, Ilara asked, "Do you think all houses have hidden rooms?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's dark hair, considering. "Maybe not rooms," she said finally, "but I think all houses have stories. The lucky ones have families brave enough to find them." Ilara smiled, the first full smile Sarah had seen from her, transforming her serious little face into something luminous. "We're lucky then." "Yes," Sarah whispered, kissing her forehead. "We are." As she closed the door, leaving it cracked just enough for hallway light to enter, Sarah heard Ilara whisper, "Good night, house. Good night, everyone who lives here now." It is. And for the first time, that included them all, the living and the remembered, held together by the choice to see what others had overlooked, to love what others had forgotten.